Africans have always had reverence for the unknown, but not in the way you think. It is no secret that in many of our families, someone is always suspected of blocking your destiny. Your setback, it wasn't bad luck. Your illness, no, it wasn't just nature. In African societies, misfortune is rarely just misfortune. It is often believed that someone somewhere wanted it to happen, and in most cases this person is in close proximity to us. And this paranoia, it isn't just cultural, it's been nurtured, amplified, and exploited. The African film industry, particularly Nollywood, knows this. It capitalizes on our deep-seated anxieties, repackaging our feared superstitions into low-budgeted horror films that blur the lines between fiction and deeply held belief. These films don't just entertain, they reinforce ancient superstitions, deepen mistrust, and turn folklore into absolute truth. What started as ancestral wisdom has transformed into a commercialized industry. But I do have concerns about the way African horror storytelling has stagnated, relying on the same recycled tropes that do more harm than good. What happens when distorted stories become inherited truths? When horror films do more than scare but condition? Africans have always had access to the spiritual plane. Our ancestors understood that the physical and spiritual realms were deeply intertwined, shaping the way they interpreted and made sense of the world. But somewhere along the way, that wisdom was tempered with, misinterpreted, distorted, and reshaped into something far more sinister. To this day, we instinctively turn to supernatural explanations for our life's misfortunes, making us experience a version of reality shaped by fear rather than reality itself. Over generations, our psyches have been conditioned to fear the unseen, to mistrust those closest to us, and to exist in a state of quiet paranoia. We remain divided not just by reality but by the stories we've been told. And Nollywood horror, it doesn't just tell stories, it recycles, reinforces, and profits from our deepest fears. Watching African films really feels like pure entertainment. It's less about being immersed in the experience and more about just following a storyline. Because the craft itself, the scenery, cinematography, editing style, sound design, costumes, more often than not, they feel unpolished. Predictable storytelling have long plagued African cinema. At what point do we demand better? It's 2025, for God's sake. Despite Nollywood being the second largest film industry in the world, it has cemented itself as a dominant force in African pop culture. But here's the thing, many of us don't actually feel connected to the movies it produces. Now, don't get me wrong, Nollywood is a powerhouse. Nigeria is a massive country with a strong sense of national pride, and its people love supporting their own. But with globalization, it's impossible not to compare our local films to the high production value of Western cinema. And once that comparison is made, watching Nollywood films can feel like a drag. Ask the average African what their favorite movie of all time is, and chances are it won't be an African film. Many Nollywood films outright defy logic. At times, watching them feels less like entertainment and more like an exercise in losing brain cells. Hear me out. At this point, we should be demanding stories that challenge us, not just ones that happen to us. The Nigerian film industry is thriving, a prolific powerhouse that remains accessible to both the rich and the poor. Say what you will about its flaws, but at least Africans are the ones telling African stories. Yes, many of these films suffer from poor storytelling, questionable writing, and low budgets. And yes, sometimes they fail spectacularly, but the power to narrate our own experiences is in our hands, and that alone is worth something. Nigeria is densely populated, so much so that no matter where you travel in the world, you're almost guaranteed to bump into a Nigerian. Nigeria is often described as an ethnocentric nation, with tribes like the Yoruba and Igbo holding significant cultural influence. Naturally, these divisions shape how Nigerian audiences engage with Nollywood. Nollywood films are produced along ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines, making it difficult to define the industry as a true representation of a singular Nigerian national culture. Because in reality, Nigeria itself is not a unified nation in the traditional sense. African horror is more than just entertainment. It is a reflection of deeply ingrained cultural fears, spiritual beliefs, and the ways we make sense of the unknown. To truly dissect this genre, we need to examine the nature of Nollywood horror, how it has shaped our collective realities, reinforcing our deepest anxieties and embedded these fears into the voices we grew up watching. Nollywood horror films thrive on unique brands of storytelling, one that blurs the lines between fiction and lived experience. These movies do not simply tell ghost stories for the sake of thrills. They affirm long-standing beliefs in witches, curses, and supernatural forces. The narratives we see on screen are often the same stories widespread within our communities. Tales of jealous neighbors using juju to sabotage success, tales of ancestors punishing those who stray from tradition. Witchcraft and traditional spirituality are dominated themes in Nollywood, especially in horror films, but their portrayal is often far from neutral. Instead of offering a nuanced exploration of African spirituality, Nollywood horror has played a significant role in shaping public perception, often reducing these practices to symbols of evil, destruction, and misfortune. Witchcraft is depicted as the root of all suffering. A character's sudden misfortune, be it poverty, illness, or death, is rarely attributed to natural causes but rather to supernatural interference. The common narrative is that an envious relative, a wicked stepmother, or a jealous neighbor has gone to the shrine to ensure another's downfall. These depictions fuel paranoia, creating a cultural climate where misfortune is rarely seen as a consequence of systemic issues or personal choices, but as the work of the unseen and unknown. Another recurring trope is the stark contrast between traditional African spirituality and Christianity. Herbalists, diviners, or spiritualists against Christian pastors, reinforcing the idea that African traditional religion is dark and sinister, while Christianity is a force of salvation. In these films, the native healer is often depicted as corrupt, dangerous, and deceitful, demanding blood sacrifices or casting spells, while the pastor, armed with prayer and the Bible, emerges victorious over evil. This binary portrayal erases the complexity of African spiritual systems and contributes to their continued marginalization. These films do more than entertain. They shape cultural attitudes and behaviors. The fear of witchcraft and supernatural harm is deeply ingrained in many African societies, and Nollywood horror only amplifies this fear. This has real-world consequences, from witch hunting practices in rural areas to the rise of deliverance churches that profit off people's fears of spiritual attacks. When we talk about the portrayal of witchcraft and traditional spirituality in Nollywood horror films, it's impossible to ignore the deep rooted influence of colonialism and the Western religious systems that came with it. The colonial powers, especially the British, aimed to suppress African spiritual practices, branding them as primitive, backward, and even evil. This historical effort to demonize African belief systems created the groundwork for the way we see witchcraft in Nollywood films today. For many Africans, Christianity became the dominant belief system promoted by colonial rule. Over time, these new Christian values didn't just replace African spirituality, they created a moral and spiritual divide. This reflects the colonial era messaging that painted African traditions as something to fear or reject, reinforcing the notions that Western Christianity is the force for good. The impact of this colonial mindset doesn't stop with religion. Witchcraft became more than just a spiritual practice. It was used as a tool for social control. The colonialists labeled any traditional spiritual practice that challenged their authority as witchcraft and suppressed it. Nollywood horror continues this tradition by portraying witchcraft as an unsettling, destabilizing force that needs to be eradicated for peace to be restored. This continues the narrative that African spiritual practices are a threat to the social order and only Western religious frameworks can offer salvation. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this portrayal is how deeply it affects our collective psyche. Nollywood horror films serve as an echo of this, perpetuating fear and misunderstanding of African spirituality. This contributes to the stigmatization of traditional healers and spiritualists. There is a real need for change here. It's time we reframe how we view African spirituality in Nollywood films. We've been given the power to tell our own stories, even if our early attempts were marred by poor storytelling and low budgets. Now it's up to us to reclaim our narratives. We have the opportunity to create stories that respect and explore the depth of African spiritual practices. When we talk about Nollywood horror, one of the most common and unsettling tropes is the portrayal of women as witches. This isn't just about supernatural evil or dark magic, it's deeper than that. It taps into a much older, more ingrained fear, the fear of women stepping into their power. In many of these films, women are shown as witches, dangerous, manipulative, and capable of wreaking havoc. The more disturbing thing here isn't the magic, it's the fear of female autonomy, the power that these portrayals feed into. It's almost as if the story is telling us when women have power, everything goes wrong. In a lot of African societies, as in many others around the world, there's been this long history of male dominated systems. Patriarchy. This culture has been woven into our storytelling. The older women, often cast as witches, are known as the main antagonists, bitter, vengeful, and threatening to the social order. These women are dangerous not because of their actions, but because they represent a power that isn't controlled by men. And that's scary on a system built on control. What makes this even more alarming is how it plays into the bigger narrative around gender. In Nollywood horror, the men, usually pastors, husbands, or community leaders, are the ones who can save the day. They have the power to defeat these women and, by extension, the power to protect the community. These male characters are framed as the moral authority, and their power is often tied to patriarchal values. It's no longer just about supernatural values, it's about reinforcing a deeper message. Women's power needs to be kept in check, or society as we know it will fall apart. The portrayal of women as witches in Nollywood is more than just a plot device. It's a way of saying that female power, especially spiritual or cultural power, is inherently dangerous. It's a reflection of how society has historically tried to suppress women's autonomy, whether through controlling their bodies, their voices, or their existence. The witchcraft in these films isn't just magic, it's a metaphor for the way women who try to step outside traditional boundaries are feared, demonized, and ultimately disempowered. This idea unfortunately seeps into real life. In a society where women's voices and power are often marginalized, Nollywood horror films are, in a sense, reinforcing those same patriarchal structures. The other unsettling theme that dominates the Nollywood horror, I don't even want to call it horror, but that dominates the scary genre, the obsession with money rituals and the fear surrounding the rich using dark forces to gain their wealth. I mean, this isn't just a spooky plot point for shock value. It's a reflection of the deeply entrenched societal anxieties about wealth, power, and how they are acquired. In many of these films, characters, usually the poor or desperate, are shown engaging in dark rituals, often led by a spiritual practitioner to attain untold riches. The catch, these rituals often require a sacrifice. The underlying message here is clear. Wealth, especially sudden and inexplicable wealth, isn't natural. It's the product of evil, of tapping into forces beyond our control or understanding. In other words, the more wealth someone acquires, the more likely it is they use dark magic or occult forces to get it. This portrayal of wealth acquired through occult practices is not just for the plot. It reflects the deep rooted belief that extreme wealth comes at a moral cost, especially in the context of post colonial African societies, where inequality and corruption often taint the story of wealth accumulation. The rich are rarely portrayed as self made. Instead, their success is seen as either a consequence of manipulation or evil deals. This reflects our societal suspicion that if someone is rich, they may have crossed some kind of moral line to get there. In a society where corruption often leads to sudden wealth, these films tap into the unsettling thought that those who succeed too quickly have done so at the expense of others, using forces beyond ordinary understanding. This notion reinforces the belief that wealth is inherently corrupting and that achieving it without resorting to supernatural means seems almost impossible. And in a way, these films offer comfort by aligning with the idea that despite all the inequality around us, the world still follows some form of moral justice through the lens of dark rituals and the occult. What does this do to the psyche of the everyday viewer? It reinforces the belief that wealth, especially in its most extreme form, is inherently evil or tainted. The idea that someone could achieve wealth without resorting to dark powers seems unimaginable. These films teach us that if you're poor, you're either struggling for a good reason. Come on, pal. Come on, pal. But if you're rich, you must have made a deal with the devil. It places an impossible standard on how we view money and success. In a way, Nollywood horror reflects and sometimes distorts the anxieties of a society trying to make sense of rapid social and economical changes. We're in the third world, for God's sake. It's easy to see why these stories resonate. In a world where many struggle to survive, the idea of rich being untouched by moral consequences and their wealth through dark rituals becomes an almost comforting narrative. It allows us to believe that the world still follows some kind of moral disorder, even if we can't always see it. It's been an intense few days diving into Nollywood horror films, and while I can't say I've found a story that left me shaken to my core, one thing is undeniable. These filmmakers are experimenting and evolving with each new production. There is a real effort to level up, and we can see the development happening in real time. But come on. Watching these films, especially in comparison to Western and Eastern horror, has only deepened my understanding of how culture shapes fear. Each region reflects its own societal fears. There's still so much untapped potential, really. We haven't touched the surface. That said, it's clear that we've got a long road ahead in many aspects. Will I dive back into this world of Nollywood horror? Probably, maybe not. Maybe next time when I venture into the terrifying realms of South African, Kenyan, or Tanzanian horror. But for now, I feel like Huey from the Boondocks. After weeks of drowning in the shadow depths of BT, my brain is fried and I can almost feel something shifted in my subconscious. I have no doubt that Nollywood, along with the rest of Africa, will continue to grow and redefine what horror truly means on this continent. And when that breakthrough finally comes, when African horror truly steps into its own, that's going to be a game changer, and I hope I'll be there for it. But for now, I am taking a break. Bye. Mwah. Thank you for watching, beloved.